Conspiracies aren't just the stuff of fiction. Some have turned out to be shockingly real, proving that truth is often more unsettling than speculation. For years, people dismissed these as paranoia, ridiculing those who dared to ask questions. But when the truth finally came out, it was far worse than anyone imagined. Here are 5 real conspiracies, covered up, denied, and even called crazy, until undeniable proof forced the world to accept the reality. Big Tobacco lied about smoking and cancer. For most of the 20th century, smoking was everywhere. Cigarette ads filled magazines, billboards, and even television screens. They featured doctors in white coats, smiling and endorsing their favorite brands. More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette, the ads claimed. Smoking was a sign of sophistication, an everyday habit for millions. But there was one major problem. Cigarettes were killing people. As early as the 1940s and 50s, tobacco companies knew smoking caused lung cancer. Internal research conducted by Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds, and other industry giants showed a clear link between smoking and deadly diseases. But instead of warning the public, they did the exact opposite. They buried the research. They hired scientists to spread misinformation. They manipulated public opinion, funding studies that suggested air pollution or genetics were responsible for rising cancer rates. Anything but tobacco. For decades, Big Tobacco lied under oath, swearing to Congress that nicotine was not addictive, despite internal documents proving they had intentionally increased nicotine levels to keep people hooked. They even marketed to children, using cartoon mascots like Joe Camel to create a new generation of smokers. By the 1960s, the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. The U.S. Surgeon General's 1964 report confirmed what Big Tobacco had known all along: smoking causes cancer. But the industry still refused to admit fault. It wasn't until 1998, more than 30 years later, that they were finally forced to tell the truth. The Master Settlement Agreement required tobacco companies to pay billions in damages, fund anti-smoking campaigns, and stop targeting children. By then, millions had already died from smoking-related illnesses, victims of a cover-up that should never have happened. The CIA and the coup in Iran, Operation Ajax. In 1953, Iran was on the brink of real independence. The country had a democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, who was determined to make a bold move: take back Iran's oil from British control. For decades, Iran's oil had been controlled by a British company, Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, known today as BP. The profits flowed to London, while Iran received a mere fraction. Mossadegh had had enough. He nationalized Iran's oil industry, cutting Britain out of the deal. Britain was furious, but they couldn't take military action alone. So they turned to the United States for help. The CIA, eager to prevent any government that leaned away from Western influence, launched Operation Ajax, a top-secret coup to overthrow Mossadegh and install a leader loyal to Western interests. Here's how they did it. The CIA and British intelligence bribed Iranian officials, spread false propaganda, and hired mobs to riot in the streets. They planted fake stories in Iranian newspapers, claiming Mossadegh was corrupt, unstable, and even working with the Soviet Union, a powerful accusation during the Cold War. Soon the country was in turmoil. The unrest escalated until Mossadegh was forcibly removed and arrested. The Shah of Iran, who had been on shaky ground, was now reinstated as an absolute monarch, with full backing from the U.S. and Britain. For decades, Operation Ajax was dismissed as a conspiracy theory. The CIA and British government denied any involvement. But in 2013, declassified documents finally confirmed everything. The coup wasn't just real. It completely reshaped Iran's history, fueling the resentment that would eventually lead to the 1979 Iranian Revolution and decades of hostility toward the U.S. What was once called a paranoid fantasy turned out to be one of the most consequential government conspiracies of the 20th century. The Manhattan Project, the secret creation of the atomic bomb. World War II was raging, and scientists had made a terrifying discovery. Splitting an atom could unleash an explosion unlike anything the world had ever seen. The U.S. government, fearing that Nazi Germany was developing nuclear weapons, launched the Manhattan Project, a top-secret program to build the world's first atomic bomb. This was so secret that even Vice President Harry Truman didn't know about it until he became president. From 1942 to 1945, the U.S. gathered some of the greatest scientific minds in history, including J. Robert Oppenheimer and Albert Einstein, to work on this unprecedented weapon. The project cost $2 billion, involved over 130,000 people, and was spread across multiple secret sites, including Los Alamos, New Mexico. Finally, on July 16, 1945, the first successful atomic bomb test, codenamed Trinity, was conducted in the New Mexico desert. The explosion was so powerful that scientists watching the blast suffered sunburns from miles away. Just weeks later, on August 6, 1945, the U.S. dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan, followed by a second on Nagasaki 3 days later. The devastation was unimaginable, killing hundreds of thousands instantly and forcing Japan to surrender, ending World War II. For years, people suspected that the U.S. had conducted secret nuclear experiments, but the full extent of the Manhattan Project wasn't revealed until decades later. It remains one of the biggest secrets ever kept, proving that governments are willing to hide world-altering projects from the public until they have no choice but to reveal the truth. Operation Mockingbird, the CIA's control over the media. What if I told you that much of the news you read in the 1950s, 60s, and even today was influenced, if not directly controlled, by the CIA? During the Cold War, the U.S. government feared communist propaganda. But instead of simply countering it, they launched their own secret propaganda campaign, Operation Mockingbird. The CIA secretly recruited journalists, planted fake news, and infiltrated major media organizations, including the New York Times, Washington Post, and Time magazine. They paid reporters, manipulated stories, and ensured that certain narratives dominated the headlines. For years, anyone who suggested the media was controlled by the CIA was called a conspiracy theorist, until the 1975 Church Committee hearings exposed the program. Former CIA Director William Colby admitted that the agency had assets in major news organizations across America. Even though the CIA claimed to have stopped Operation Mockingbird, many believe that media manipulation never really ended, only became more sophisticated. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, the fake attack, that started a war in 1964, the United States was looking for a reason to go to war with Vietnam. The Cold War was at its peak, and American leaders were eager to stop the spread of communism. But they needed an excuse, something to convince the public and Congress that military action was necessary. Then came the Gulf of Tonkin incident. On August 2, 1964, the U.S. destroyer USS Maddox was patrolling the waters off North Vietnam when it reported being attacked by 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats. The U.S. returned fire, damaging the enemy ships. 2 days later, on August 4th, another attack was reported, this time at night during bad weather. American ships opened fire once again. The news spread quickly. President Lyndon B. Johnson went on television, telling the American people that the U.S. Navy had been attacked unprovoked. Congress immediately passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving Johnson the power to wage war in Vietnam without an official declaration. There was just one problem. The second attack never happened. Years later, declassified documents and military reports confirmed that the second attack was a false alarm, likely caused by radar errors, bad weather, or nervous sailors. But by the time the truth came out, the damage had been done. The Gulf of Tonkin gave the U.S. a blank check to escalate the Vietnam War, leading to the deaths of over 58,000 American soldiers and millions of Vietnamese civilians. What was once dismissed as a crazy conspiracy theory turned out to be one of the biggest lies in American history, a fabricated attack used to justify war. COINTELPRO, the FBI's secret war on activists. Throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the FBI was running a secret program called COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. Its goal? To spy on, infiltrate, and sabotage civil rights groups, political activists, and anyone who challenged the government. At the time, the U.S. was going through major social change. The civil rights movement was fighting against segregation, the anti-war movement was growing, and groups like the Black Panthers, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and even feminist organizations were gaining support. The FBI saw these activists as a threat to national security. Instead of simply monitoring them, they actively worked to destroy them. They wiretapped Martin Luther King Jr., sent him anonymous letters urging him to kill himself, and tried to ruin his reputation. They infiltrated the Black Panther Party, planting informants and spreading false information to turn members against each other. They created fake documents and news stories to discredit activists, making them look like criminals or extremists. They tried to break up anti-war protests, targeting journalists and whistleblowers. For years, COINTELPRO was dismissed as a myth, until 1971, when a group of activists broke into an FBI office in Pennsylvania and stole classified documents. They leaked the files to the press, and suddenly, the world knew the truth. The FBI had been spying on and sabotaging American citizens for decades, all under the guise of protecting national security. Once the program was exposed, the FBI claimed to shut it down, but many believe that similar operations still exist today, just under different names. Project Sunshine. The U.S. government stole dead bodies for nuclear testing. It sounds like something out of a horror movie, the government stealing dead bodies without permission and using them for experiments. But this wasn't fiction. It was called Project Sunshine, and it was very real. After World War II, the U.S. was racing to understand the effects of nuclear radiation. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had caused massive destruction, but scientists still didn't fully understand how radiation affected the human body. So, what did they do? They stole dead bodies, mostly infants and young children, and used them for experiments. Without informing parents or families, the U.S. and British governments secretly collected body parts, bones, and organs from deceased people around the world. The bodies were used to test radiation exposure, without consent, without public knowledge, and without any legal permission. For years, this sounded too disturbing to be real, until declassified documents in the 1990s finally confirmed it. The families of the victims were never informed, and many didn't learn the truth until decades later. What was once a wild conspiracy theory turned out to be one of the most unethical scientific experiments in history. Operation Paperclip. The U.S. recruited Nazi scientists after World War II. After World War II ended, the world thought Nazi Germany was completely dismantled. War criminals were put on trial and justice was served. But behind the scenes, the U.S. government had a different plan. Instead of punishing all Nazi officials, the U.S. secretly recruited hundreds of Nazi scientists, engineers, and doctors, giving them new identities, clearing their criminal records, and bringing them to America. This was known as Operation Paperclip. Why? Because the U.S. was locked in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, and these Nazi scientists were some of the most advanced minds in the world. They had knowledge of rockets, chemical weapons, and even mind control experiments. The U.S. decided that instead of letting the Soviets get them first, they would offer them jobs, homes, and freedom in exchange for their expertise. Some of the most infamous Nazi scientists were brought to America, including Werner von Braun, who had worked directly under Hitler developing V-2 rockets. In the U.S., he became one of the key architects of NASA and helped America land on the moon. For decades, the U.S. denied the existence of Operation Paperclip. It was written off as Cold War paranoia. But eventually, declassified files proved it was real. The U.S. harbored war criminals, erased their pasts, and used their knowledge to advance American military and space technology. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment. The U.S. government used black men as medical test subjects. For 40 years, from 1932 to 1972, the U.S. government conducted one of the most inhumane medical experiments in history, the Tuskegee syphilis study. The U.S. Public Health Service recruited hundreds of poor black men in Alabama, telling them they would receive free health care. What they didn't tell them was that they were being used as medical test subjects. These men had syphilis, a deadly disease. But instead of treating them, doctors let the disease progress to study its effects. Even when penicillin was discovered as a cure in 1947, these men were deliberately denied treatment, just to see how their bodies would deteriorate. For decades, the experiment was kept secret, but in 1972, a whistleblower exposed the truth. The public was outraged. A lawsuit followed, and the survivors were finally compensated. The Tuskegee experiment wasn't just a conspiracy theory. It was a real example of government medical abuse that still haunts American history. The Iran-Contra affair, the U.S. secretly sold weapons to Iran and funded rebels illegally. During the 1980s, the U.S. government had two major problems: an ongoing hostage crisis in the Middle East and a Cold War battle against communism in Latin America. Instead of dealing with these problems legally, the Reagan administration came up with a secret, illegal plan, one that would become known as the Iran-Contra affair. Here's what happened. At the time, Iran was fighting a brutal war with Iraq, and the U.S. had officially banned weapons sales to Iran. But behind the scenes, top officials in the Reagan administration secretly sold missiles to Iran. In exchange, Iran would pressure terrorist groups to release American hostages. But that wasn't the end of the scheme. The money from these illegal arms sales was then funneled to right-wing rebel groups in Nicaragua, known as the Contras. The problem? Congress had already banned funding for the Contras, making this operation completely illegal. For years, the Reagan administration denied everything. But in 1986, a Lebanese newspaper exposed the secret arms deals, and soon after, leaked documents revealed the full scandal. Congress launched a massive investigation, and top officials were convicted, though most of them were later pardoned. Reagan himself claimed he had no idea what was happening, but many believed he knew all along. The Iran-Contra affair proved that the U.S. government was willing to break its own laws and lie to the American people to achieve its goals. Operation Northwoods, the U.S. military planned fake terror attacks to justify war. It sounds like a twisted conspiracy theory, but it was very real. In 1962, the U.S. government wanted an excuse to invade Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro. Instead of waiting for a real attack, the Pentagon devised a plan to stage fake terrorist attacks on American soil. The plan, called Operation Northwoods, included blowing up U.S. ships and blaming Cuba, staging fake hijackings of commercial planes, planting bombs in American cities, faking attacks on military bases, murdering U.S. citizens and making it look like Cuba was responsible. The goal? To create public outrage and force the U.S. into war with Cuba. The plan made it all the way to President John F. Kennedy's desk. To his credit, Kennedy refused to approve it, but the fact that high-ranking military officials were willing to kill Americans to justify war shocked the world when the documents were finally declassified in 1997. For decades, anyone who suggested that the U.S. government would stage false flag attacks was laughed at. But Operation Northwoods proved that such plans have been seriously considered at the highest levels of power. The business plot, a plan to overthrow the U.S. government. In 1933, a group of wealthy businessmen and bankers hatched a plan to overthrow President Franklin D. Roosevelt and install a fascist dictatorship in America. Yes, you read that right. The plan was simple. Recruit a highly respected military leader, gather an army of 500,000 men, march on Washington, and force Roosevelt to step down. Their ideal leader, Major General Smedley Butler, one of the most decorated military officers in U.S. history. But there was one problem. Butler wasn't on board. Instead of going along with the plot, he turned on the conspirators and exposed the plan to Congress. A full investigation was launched, and the findings were shocking. The people involved were some of the richest and most powerful men in America, including executives from J.P. Morgan, DuPont, and General Motors. Despite the overwhelming evidence, no one was arrested. The media downplayed the story, and the government brushed it under the rug. If Butler hadn't blown the whistle, America could have had a fascist coup. What was once dismissed as paranoid nonsense was actually a real exposed conspiracy,